Hello. Thanks. This is take three. I'm not doing a very good job. We'll see how it goes. Um, Today I'm going to be talking about Sweden again. I did a video about 8 days, 10 days ago about what many people are calling the Sweden experiment, where Sweden is using a much um, looser set of restrictions and voluntary distancing measures and allowing some of the infection to spread with the idea that they'll generate herd immunity over time with managing fairly modest losses in the meantime and end up being much safer down the road as other waves of this pandemic may reoccur. And when I talked about this a few weeks ago, this was one of the articles I had referred to, which is um, that was titled "Has Sweden Found the Right Solution to the Coronavirus?" And the key thing that they were saying in here is that most countries at that point were going into a very serious form of a lockdown. And many people expected that after 2 or 3 or 5 or 9 weeks, when they emerged from lockdown, that the infection rates would be much lower, which is pretty much guaranteed to happen if they truly segregate, lock down, spatially isolate. In this article, they argued that congratulating yourselves on the success of that strategy is folly if in fact you could have achieved that same result without those very difficult economic and personal sacrifices, the draconian measures that many of us have taken. And they argued that Sweden was going to come out in the same place or better without having done any of that. One of the epidemiologists from Sweden, Johan, pronounce his last name, actually had said very recently that the science supported Sweden's approach and that Norway and Denmark had taken a political approach trying to show strength for their citizens rather than following the science. And but in the last couple of days, weekish, there's been a lot of articles that suggest there's a growing turmoil within Sweden and about this approach. There have been many Swedish academics that have signed a letter demanding that the country change its tack and follow the more conservative lockdown strategy as cases and deaths mount. One of the things that they've discovered is that they need to do a lot more testing. And this is something that's become a common theme throughout many of the discussions, that testing needs to be ramped up 10 or 100-fold in many countries for us to be able to know where the infection is and manage it without being completely locked down. In the last few days, there's been a number of papers that have talked about the increase in cases, but the jump in coronavirus deaths that we're seeing in Sweden. And when you look at relative to the other what we call Scandinavian countries, which I think are often referred to as Nordic countries, so that would be Denmark and Norway and Finland, that Sweden's per capita death rates are dramatically higher. And one of the recent studies that was published, again, this is Professor Johan, I can't pronounce his last name, they did a study in Sweden on blood donors and found that 11 out of 100 had developed antibodies to the coronavirus. So they're doing a serum test for the antibody. And that number was 10 times higher than what they would have expected from the number of confirmed cases. So they concluded that there must be a huge number of asymptomatic people out there that have gotten the disease and are now immune because they've developed antibodies. And that's a theory that's been argued quite a bit. There was actually a study out of Stanford that also showed dramatically higher rates of prevalence of the antibodies in people's bloods than you'd expect from the number of known cases. But there's some huge problems there because the antibody tests may or may not be accurate enough for us to be able to draw those conclusions. And there's a lot of evidence mounting that because there are 4 coronaviruses that are common colds that we get, it may be that these tests are picking up on people that have developed immunity to a common cold, and because it's a coronavirus, different one, but a coronavirus, that the test is going to be fooled. If that's the case, then all of this information is completely garbage. And I suspect that these data are tremendously flawed. Moving on, there was some discussion after that study was published that suggested that the rate of immunity would be heading toward 20% in Stockholm by sort of the beginning of May. And that was high enough, according to Dr. Anders Tegnell, the epidemiologist. He's not supposed to have an apostrophe in his name. That was my bad. That was why the case numbers in Stockholm were slowing, and that they were feeling confident that they had turned the corner. On the same day, though, the public health agency that released the report about the 11 out of 100 samples testing positive withdrew the report, said we've discovered an error in the report, and the authors are currently going through the material again, and they'll republish the report as soon as it is ready. This was announced via Twitter. There's been no discussion about what the error was or what it might mean. And then 2 days ago, on the 24th, Sweden in the last few days have had a number of significant high daily death totals. And so in the last 24 hours before the 24th, 131 deaths have been reported in Sweden, bringing the total well over 2,000. And there was also an uptick in the number of cases in Stockholm. And so at a discussion or a news conference, Anders Tegnell acknowledged it's definitely not over. And he said, we see that especially in the small rise in Stockholm again. That's the greatest concentration of people in Sweden. And if that's rising again, that's a very bad sign. So what does the data look like? I'm going to show you some information from the website Our World in Data. Our World in Data is a spectacular website for doing your own research on what you think is going on. They have a large number of tests. So this is just an example. Well, this is their COVID thing. Daily COVID tests per 1,000 people, confirmed cases, daily cases per million people, 3-day rolling average. So when you click on one of those, let's look at the daily confirmed cases, 3-day rolling average. We're going to get a chart, and we can roll our mouse along here and see the values for that chart. But I don't want to compare South Korea to the United Kingdom right now. I want to actually click on Add Country and take off all those countries, and instead I want to focus on who? I want to focus on Denmark, which starts with a D. Let's find Finland with an F. Let's go and find Norway with an N. And Sweden. And I'm going to put in 2 more. I'm going to put in Switzerland, because some people have argued that Switzerland, the way its population is structured and the size and so forth, it's a good comparator to Sweden. I don't know if I think that's true. And then the UK, because the UK had originally hoped to take the same kind of voluntary distance measures stance, but some modeling at the Imperial College of London convinced them that that was too dangerous, and they switched paths. So I've marked those, and now what we see is those countries are now marked on the graph. So here's Norway at the very bottom, and Finland and Denmark, and then Switzerland, and then Sweden, and way up here is United Kingdom. Now these are daily confirmed cases as a raw number. These are not per capita or per million population. So if you have many more people, and England is, the UK has many more, I think it's maybe 6 times the population of Sweden. I'm trying to remember if that's right. I think it is. You'd expect there to be the potential for a lot more cases. So you might instead want to go to the daily confirmed cases per million 3-day rolling average. Hey, look, my scan's complete. It'll plot it to you on a map as well, but you can turn it back into the chart, and then we can, of course, go in and do the same thing. Let's find, I'm just going to grab Denmark, if I can find it. Oh, it's on this side now. I'm going to scroll down and grab Sweden. I missed it, didn't I? Sweden, and then the UK. Because I want to talk about the per capita rate is a very important way of looking at data. So now I like this. And what I see is that Denmark is here, Sweden and the UK are up here. So Sweden has started out much lower than the UK, but it's actually now basically caught up. So that at this point in time, both Sweden and the United Kingdom have very high rates of cases per million people, but the United Kingdom's, from your direction, is trending down, and Sweden is still trending up. So that suggests that Sweden's in for a very bumpy ride. Okay, so this is what I was looking at. And I've created several of those graphics. This is daily cases per million people. And from all this information from many of those countries, so this is daily, not total, I've pulled out Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, and I've marked here the 50 per million. And I wanted to show you that Norway was rising early and peaked early April at around 50 and has been declining. Denmark rose and peaked in mid-April and is declining. Sweden started out lower than both of those and is now at and above the 50 level and still growing. So they're going in different directions. When you look at total cases per million people, and this is looking at, so that instead of daily cases, these are those accumulation curves. And what you see is I've dragged right here the vectors for Sweden and for Denmark. And it looks like I grabbed Finland instead of Norway. But in any case, or Denmark, which should I use? I can't tell. But what you'll see as you go from March 31st to April 25th through time, the totals have to go up because they're totals. That's the nature of them. But if you look, for example, at Iceland, which had a very high infection early on, they had 5,000 per million people April 14th. 11 days later, it's 5,200. That's a very small percentage increase. Switzerland had almost 3,000. It's at 3,300. That's about 10%. But Sweden had 1,000 and now has 1,700. That's a 70% increase. So it went from second lowest now to fourth and is growing at a very high rate, that steep curve. Daily deaths per million. Again, you'll see in the daily deaths per million people that Denmark and Norway, Finland, they're all down here, and Sweden has been climbing through time. The United Kingdom had a huge problem, but they seem to be bending the curve downward. Sweden does not. And you can see that in the daily deaths per million rolling average, that Sweden started out being among the very low ones, a third of that of Switzerland or Europe, for example, and much lower than the United Kingdom. And by April 21st, they're far higher than the average for Europe or Switzerland or Denmark or Norway, and they're higher still on the 25th. And if we talk about the daily deaths per million people, 10 in Sweden versus 1.6 in Denmark and 1.5 in Norway. Talking probably about a 7-fold difference. That's a huge difference. And this is total deaths per million people accumulated. And again, what I've done is I've drawn vectors at the end of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway and pulled them from here over here so you can compare them. So Denmark and Norway are accumulating cases at a very low rate. Sweden's at a very high rate. So Sweden is much, much higher than Norway and Denmark and Finland and Iceland, and growing quickly. The United Kingdom is also growing quickly, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out through time. I think what we'll see is Sweden will catch up. Well, is this per million? Yeah, I think Sweden might catch up and pass the United Kingdom because I think you're going to see it leveling out more quickly in Britain. So tests per thousand, I'm not going to talk about it because we've talked plenty. So Tegnell in the interview said it's definitely not over. And I think you can interpret that two ways. One, you can say that he's disappointed that the first wave of the epidemic is not over and that it's going to be worse than they had hoped for and their modeling suggested would happen, which is true. But I think the other way to look at that is it's not over until next winter or a year and a half or 2 years from now. We don't know what future waves of the coronavirus might look like. The big fear that people are talking about now as the boogeyman is what happens if coronavirus reemerges in the fall winter during influenza season, because they're both dangerous viruses and you can get both, and influenza already fills up most of our hospitals every winter, and if we have the peak of influenza season associated with a very heavy outbreak of coronavirus, it's going to be much worse than what we're having right now, which is at the very tail end of influenza season. We're lucky enough to have the coronavirus hit after much of the worst of the influenza season. So what kind of immunity rates we're going to see, how reliable antibody tests are, and so forth is going to be really important over the next couple of weeks to figure out what's going on now. And it'll be another year or two before we really look back and see whether Sweden's experiment was a success or not. I think Of all the countries we were looking at, the ones that have a chance for this to work would be the Nordic countries, because of the population density, because of the way the citizens are informed and highly educated, and they have a very good medical system. So this is not a stupid idea, and it's not impossible that they will come out very far ahead of most of the other countries when this is all done. It's also possible that they'll come out very far behind. What's clear is right now they're going to come out behind. What's not clear is in the future whether that will end up having bought them some greater immunity or robustness later on. If so, they may have gotten a brilliant strategy. And if they do just as poorly as everyone else next time around, because not that many people are immune, then they've lost a lot of lives for no reason at all. So it could be brilliant or botched. We still don't know. It's definitely not over. Thank you for watching.